Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 17A, and today we're going to talk about how the Constitution did not create a democracy. Now, we often hear talk about the original intent of the writers of the Constitution, but the founding fathers did not plan to create a political system that we have today, what we would call a democratic republic based on two national and permanent political parties. Indeed, democracy and political parties were dirty words to them. They did realize, however, that the world was likely to change, which is one reason they included an amendment process in the Constitution that has allowed this document to survive as our frame of government for so long. Now, the Constitution was not the original frame of government of the newly independent United States. The Constitution, or the states, were originally governed by the Second Continental Congress, and then from 1781 to 1789 by the Articles of Confederation. The late 19th century historians saw these articles as a disastrous failure, engendering what we call the critical period concept, in which the infant and endangered United States was saved by the godlike founding fathers. Now, that interpretation was questioned by the early 20th century historians, who argue that the Constitution was in response of moderates protecting their own economic and class interests. In this view, the Constitution was an anti-democratic counter-revolutionary document. Now, in turn, that interpretation came under attack in the mid and late 20th century. Many historians today view the Constitution as a continuation, not an antithesis of the revolution. Now, the process of creating government began in the 1770s as the colonial assemblies transformed themselves into state legislatures and governments. This process would involve a rejection of the British concept of balanced government in favor of overwhelming legislative power and a move from unwritten to written constitutions. Now, at first, the central government was the Second Continental Congress. The Articles of Confederation meant to serve as a bridge between the Congress and a federal government, were presented to the states in 1777, but not ratified by all until 1781, largely because the states retained their distrust of both centralized power and one another. Now, the articles set up a central government of sorts, but a weak one, with no executive or judiciary, no power to tax or enact any important measures without a two-thirds vote, and no power to change the structure without unanimity. Each state had one vote and thus a virtual veto power. Now, this organization was established very consciously. The states saw themselves as independent republics, retaining sovereignty and joining into a loose confederation, something like the United Nations today. They feared centralized power and sought to guarantee their own liberty through decentralization and state legislatures. Now, despite the inherent weaknesses of this frame of government, much was accomplished under the Articles, including the winning of independence and a favorable peace treaty in 1783 with a western boundary for the United States all the way to the Mississippi River. State governments were also established under the Articles, with many social and political reforms, including the extension of the franchise, or vote, frequent elections, and the separation of church and state. The pattern for Western expansion and settlement was also established with the Northwest Ordinances of 1784, 1785, and 1787. Internationally, the Articles opened trade with European powers and Asia. So there were some benefits with the Articles of Confederation. By 1787, problems under the Articles appeared to outweigh successes. The Confederate Congress had no power to tax and thus to pay for a military force or pay its debts. The nation's military power rested, essentially, with untrained and unreliable state militias. This translated into a lack of power in foreign affairs and a lack of respect from European nations. Now, a post-war economic depression was also blamed on the Articles. To halt land foreclosures, states began to repudiate debts and print paper money, causing inflation. Now, such measures were easy to enact because there was little or no check on legislative powers in the states. Some states established their own currencies and trading systems, causing a breakdown in interstate relations and presenting the danger that states would turn to European allies for interventions. Now, with Shays' Rebellion, a march of 1,200 men on the Supreme Court in Massachusetts and on an arsenal, fear of anarchy spread. No national army was available to halt the rebellion, and although the state militia did, it could just have easily failed from lack of training or even joined the revolt. Now, these problems convinced many that the national government was incapable of defending the liberty won during the Revolution, and that a new frame of government was necessary. Note that the definition of liberty here was not democracy, but individual freedom from tyranny, either from above or below. Now, the Revolution had fought successfully for liberty and against tyranny from above, but the threat now seemed to be tyranny from below, mob rule, as in Shays' Rebellion. Now, with the danger of European intervention and the possible destruction of the Republican experiment, tyranny from above had not been eliminated either. In 1787, a special convention was called to revise and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. Revolutionary leaders Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were present, but aside from these two, most of the delegates were quite young. Many were veterans of Washington's Continental Army or the Continental Congress, which gave them a national as opposed to a state outlook. The representatives were simultaneously conservative and revolutionary. They were men of property who feared democracy and mob rule as destructive of liberty, but they were also revolutionaries who desired to create something new, a republic with centralized power to preserve rather than destroy liberty. Now, their basic dilemma was this: how to create a government strong enough to preserve liberty from the tyranny of the mob or European monarchs without giving it enough power to be tyrannical itself. In the 51st Federalist paper, James Madison noted, "A dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. Thus, the Constitution begins, 'We the people.' Sovereignty, in essence, rests with the people." The Constitution separates sovereignty from rule via a series of intermediaries and divides power among those intermediaries to avoid tyranny. Now, we know this system as checks and balances, and it exists on two levels: separation of powers among the three branches of national government, and the second, division of powers between the national government and the state governments. Now, the founders returned to the concept of balanced government because of the perceived excesses and weaknesses of existing legislative governments. They sought to combine elements of a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a democracy within the new national government. The president would be a monarch, indirectly elected via the electoral college by elite electors, the aristocracy, with a 4-year term and powers limited to those enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution. The Senate would be an aristocratic branch, indirectly elected by the people through the state legislators, with a 6-year term and the powers listed in Article 1 of the Constitution. The national judiciary would also be aristocratic. The House of Representatives would be the Democratic branch, with short terms, albeit still with property qualifications for voting. Now, as we know, each branch has the power to check the others. For example, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but Congress appropriates funds for the military and declares war. The new national government had enormous powers, but did not have a monopoly on power. The 10th Amendment of our Constitution explicitly reaffirmed that all powers, not delegated to the new national government or prohibited by it to the states, would be reserved to the states, each capable of checking the other. The Constitution set up a large republic, something that, according to political theory of the day, would not survive. In the 10th Federalist Paper, Madison turned this theory on its head, claiming that a republic in a large area had a better chance of preserving liberty than one in a small area. For Madison, factions were the key problem in sustaining a republic. In a democracy, a majority faction, a group willing to ride roughshod over the rights of others to ensure its own interests, could easily gain control and destroy liberty. Such factions cannot be abolished without abolishing liberty, but they must be controlled via checks and balances. A large republic can do this better than small ones, because the greater population and area resulted in more factions and a reduced chance that one would dominate. Despite agreement on certain essentials, disagreements among the delegates almost wrecked the convention. Major disputes pitted large states against small ones over the issue of representation, and northern states against southern on issues related to slavery. Delegates also split over just how much power to give the national government at the expense of the states. Some delegates feared that despite the checks and balances, the new national government had too much power. Only 39 of 55 delegates signed the final document. The Constitution called for special state ratifying conventions, with ratification by 9 states required to put the document into effect. Intense opposition emerged in virtually every state, primarily from the established groups who controlled state governments and feared centralized power. The pro-Constitution forces won the struggle for a number of reasons. First, they were better organized. Second, they were on the offensive. And third, they had the advantage of defining themselves as Federalists, while their opponents were labeled Anti-Federalists. The ratification process also bypassed state legislators that had a vested interest in the failure of the new system. Further, the Federalists also agreed to address a key anti-Federalist objection, the lack of a specific Bill of Rights. Creating one would be the first order of business under the new government. Now, the final version of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers show the founders as Hobbesian realists who distrusted human nature and sought to stop what they considered the excesses of revolution. In that sense, they can be viewed as conservative and even counter-revolutionary. Simultaneously, however, they were still Lockeans and revolutionaries who wanted to preserve their Republican experiment against what they considered clear and present dangers, and were willing to try a radical and unprecedented experiment to do so. The founders succeeded in establishing a new frame of government, but in the process, they left a series of unanswered questions that would cause a split among them within a few years and would be bequeathed to their successors. So this is the end of today's lecture on whether or not the Constitution created a democracy. This is History 17A with Professor Hasselman.